In the small town of Raventon, there was a library that had been closed for years. The town's children used to joke about it, calling it the Midnight Library. Its windows were boarded up, its doors locked tight with rusted chains, and the shadows inside felt wrong. Locals claimed that odd things happened around midnight there. Whispers carried on the wind, flickering lights, and a faint sound of a clock ticking down to something unknown. Sasha, an insomniac and a skeptic, had always brushed off the rumors about the library as small-town folklore. She was a graduate student visiting her grandmother, and her insomnia was back with a vengeance. Desperate for something to do, she found herself walking the town's empty streets at night, half hoping the midnight air would tire her out. That was how she ended up standing outside the old library just as her phone's clock struck midnight. As she stared at the cracked stone building, a strange sound broke the silence, a faint ticking. A chill crept down her spine, but curiosity got the better of her. She pushed on the heavy oak doors, surprised when they creaked open. Inside, the smell of dust and age hit her like a wave. Shadows danced along the walls, and the ticking grew louder. Sasha stepped into the library, and, to her horror, the doors slammed shut behind her. She tugged at them, but they wouldn't budge. She was trapped. It was darker than she'd expected. The only light came from old-fashioned oil lamps lining the walls, casting eerie shadows on rows of towering shelves. The ticking continued, echoing from somewhere deep within the building. It was like no library Sasha had ever seen. The shelves seemed to go on forever, the aisles spiraling in impossible directions, some leading up staircases that seemed to twist back down to where they'd started. She called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence answered. Then, faintly, a whisper came from somewhere above. "Sasha." She froze. How did this place know her name? Trying to calm herself, she told herself she was hearing things. It was late, she was tired, and her mind was playing tricks. She took a deep breath, deciding to find another exit. Maybe a window? As she moved deeper into the library, she realized something odd about the books. Their covers were all blank. She pulled one off the shelf and opened it. The pages were empty. She flipped through another, blank again. Then she noticed one with faint writing on the spine. It looked older than the others, with a cracked leather cover. The Sleepwalker's Guide. Sasha opened it and was greeted with handwritten text, scrawled in frantic strokes. She squinted to read. Asterisk, they only come at night. The Sleepwalkers. They feed on the thoughts, the fears, the memories. Once you enter, you become a part of the library. You forget who you are, but the Sleepwalkers will remember. Asterisk. A chill seeped into her bones, and she dropped the book, hearing it thud against the dusty floor. Her pulse raced. This isn't real, she whispered, though she didn't believe herself. She kept walking, faster now, weaving through endless shelves, desperately looking for a way out. The ticking grew louder. A feeling washed over her. She wasn't alone. She could feel eyes on her, hidden in the shadows between the shelves. The silence was thick, but now and then, a soft scratching sound would echo, like something dragging across the floor. She turned a corner, and in the dim light, she saw them. Figures dressed in rags, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their arms unnaturally long. They had no faces, only smooth, blank slates where their features should be. But the worst part was their movements. They twitched and jerked as if struggling against invisible strings, heads tilted in unnatural angles, their limbs hanging like broken puppets. They were the Sleepwalkers. She gasped, and their heads snapped toward her, sensing her presence. She stumbled back, heart hammering in her chest. Her breath quickened as she backed away, only to feel cold fingers brush her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. She began to run. As she raced through the labyrinth of bookshelves, a low whisper began to build in the air around her. Asterisk, join us. You'll forget. Asterisk. Her steps faltered. Images flickered in her mind. Memories of her childhood, friends' faces, her grandmother. But with each step, they felt further away, as though someone were tugging them out of her head. The whispers grew louder, hissing, "You won't remember. You won't remember." Desperation took over as she reached a winding staircase. She scrambled up, the sleepwalkers following, their twisted bodies moving faster than seemed possible. She reached a narrow corridor lined with doors, each with a brass plaque bearing a name. Different names, but each one felt strangely familiar. Sarah Hutton, Ben Ellis, Liam Park. The door at the end of the hall had her name on it. She hesitated, but the sound of the sleepwalkers drew closer, their footsteps scraping against the floor. She opened the door with trembling hands and stepped inside. It was a tiny room, with a single chair and a small table. On the table lay a book. Her heart sank as she read the cover. The Story of Sasha Lane. With a shaking hand, she opened it and found, to her horror, that it detailed everything she'd done in the library that night. The ticking, the sleepwalkers, even finding this very book. But as she flipped further, the text changed. The words were no longer describing her past. They were predictions, describing things she hadn't done yet. Her breath caught as she read. Asterisk, she will forget who she is. The sleepwalkers will take her memories, her name, her fears, leaving only the shell of a person trapped within the library. Asterisk. No, this can't be happening, she screamed, slamming the book shut. She had to get out. She had to remember who she was, what she loved, anything to keep herself grounded. The door creaked open, and one of the sleepwalkers entered. It moved slowly, methodically, tilting its head as though observing her. She backed into a corner, feeling her mind slipping away, her memories fading one by one. She clutched her head, trying to remember, trying to hold on to any scrap of herself. The sleepwalker extended a hand, its fingers unnaturally long, reaching toward her. Her last thought was of home, of the people she loved. But even that thought was fading. With a whisper, she felt herself slipping away, becoming a part of the midnight library. The next morning, the library was locked tight, as it had been for years. But now, if anyone dared press their ear against the door at midnight, they would hear a soft, ticking sound, and a faint whisper that sounded almost like her voice. I grew up in an old apartment building on the edge of town. It wasn't a remarkable place. Most units were empty, and those who lived there were often elderly or people down on their luck. There was a feeling about the building, a quiet sort of decay, like it was sinking into itself with each passing year. When I was about 13, I discovered the basement. My mom had told me to stay out of it, that it was unsafe and not meant for children, but, like any teenager, the warning only made me more curious. So one day, I decided to explore. The basement was dark, damp, and cold. I took a flashlight, its beam barely cutting through the shadows. The basement stretched on much farther than I expected, filled with a maze of old furniture, boxes stacked high with forgotten things, and endless hallways that twisted in odd directions. The air felt thick, almost like it was trying to push me back out. Then I found it. A door at the very back of the basement, set into the wall almost as an afterthought. It was an ordinary-looking door, the paint peeling, a brass doorknob that looked worn but functional. It seemed so out of place there, and for some reason, I felt a strange compulsion to open it. I turned the knob and stepped through. The room on the other side was wrong. It was just another hallway, stretching endlessly, with doors lining the walls, each one identical. I could hear a faint, low hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I thought it must have been some sort of storage or maintenance area, but as I walked forward, something about it felt unsettling. There were no lights in the hallway. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet in front of me, leaving the rest in shadow. And as I moved forward, each door looked the same, gray, featureless, with no indication of what was inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the first door I came across. It led to a room filled with boxes and clutter, old furniture draped in dusty sheets, and a mirror leaning against the wall. I shone my flashlight on it, but the mirror didn't show my reflection. It just showed the dark, empty room. I quickly shut the door and moved to the next one. This room was even stranger, completely empty, but there was a damp smell, like wet earth. I shone my light on the floor and saw muddy footprints leading from the far wall to the door, but there was no other exit or sign of where they came from. I left that room too, my heart beginning to pound. The hallway went on and on. No matter how many doors I passed, the hall seemed to stretch endlessly, each door leading to something stranger than the last. One room had nothing in it but a single chair facing the wall. Another had a dollhouse that looked eerily like my apartment building, each tiny window dark except for one room on the top floor, which glowed with a faint light. At that point, I knew I needed to turn back. But when I turned around, my flashlight only illuminated another stretch of endless hallway. The door I had come through was gone. I felt a chill run through me. I was certain of the direction, but all I saw were more doors and more hallways twisting in impossible directions. Panic set in as I realized I was completely, hopelessly lost. I tried opening a few more doors, hoping one of them would lead me out. One room was filled with fog, thick and swirling. But when I entered, the fog began to dissipate, revealing a figure in the corner, slouched over. I stepped closer, but the figure dissolved into the mist the moment I shone my light on it. My heart was pounding, and I backed out, shutting the door and stumbling further down the hall. I walked for what felt like hours. My phone had no signal, and its clock showed a time that seemed wrong. It kept flashing random numbers, never showing the correct hour or minute. My flashlight started to flicker, its beam growing dimmer, and I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining the way the shadows seemed to move at the edges of the light. Eventually, I found a door that looked different from the others. It was black, with no doorknob, just a thin slit that looked like a keyhole. I didn't have a key, but something told me that door was important. I knocked on it, even though I felt silly. But when I pressed my ear to the door, I heard something on the other side, a faint scratching, like someone dragging their nails against the wood. I stumbled back, heart racing, and as I turned, I thought I saw movement at the end of the hall. It was too far to make out clearly, but there was definitely someone, or something, standing there, watching me. I called out, my voice trembling, but it didn't answer. It only stared. I don't know how I finally escaped. One moment, I was running, pushing through doors blindly, stumbling and tripping through room after room. And then, suddenly, I was back in the basement, gasping for breath, covered in a cold sweat. The door I'd come through was gone. There was only a blank wall where it had been. I ran up the stairs and back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. For weeks, I didn't go back to the basement. I started having nightmares, though, of endless hallways, doors that led nowhere, and shadowed figures standing at the edges of my vision. But the worst part was when I told my mom about it. I was expecting her to laugh, to say I had an overactive imagination, but instead, her face turned pale. She took a deep breath and told me something I'll never forget. "You aren't the first person to see that hallway," she whispered. "When I was a kid, I saw it too. It's like the building remembers. Sometimes it shows itself, but only when it's looking for someone." I asked her what she meant, but she refused to say anything more. All she told me was to never go down to the basement again. Years have passed since then. I moved out of that building as soon as I could, but I still have the same dream almost every night. I'm in the hallway, my flashlight flickering, and somewhere in the dark, I can feel someone watching me. A few months ago, I went back to visit the building. I told myself it was just for closure, but when I asked the new tenants if they'd ever noticed anything strange about the basement, they only gave me blank stares. One of them said the basement had been sealed off for years. There was no way in. But as I was leaving, one of the children who lived there pulled on my sleeve. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, and asked me a question in a whisper. "Do you know how to get out?" They called it the Sable House. It sat on a deserted hill, crumbling and forgotten. A mansion once owned by the wealthy Sable family over 100 years ago. For as long as anyone could remember, the townspeople avoided it. The story went that it was haunted, though the details were murky. People said that something bad had happened there. A curse, some called it. But no one really knew what had happened to the Sables. Only that they vanished one night in 1904, leaving everything behind. I first heard about the Sable House during a summer I spent in that town, a small place called Greystone Hollow. My friend Caleb and I had taken up jobs there, working odd jobs to save up for college, and ended up staying with his aunt. She was the one who told us about the house, in a hushed voice over tea one evening. "It's not just haunted boys," she said, her voice low and serious. "That place, it's wrong. The air changes there, and people say if you go inside, you might never come back out. And if you do, you're not the same." Her warnings were enough to make us curious, especially Caleb. He had a thirst for the strange and a need to prove himself fearless, so naturally, he wanted to explore it. One night, he convinced me to go along. We planned it like a mission. Flashlights, a first aid kit, and even a few snacks in case we got lost. We set off just after midnight, the town silent and asleep around us. As we walked up the hill toward the mansion, the wind picked up, carrying a chill that raised the hairs on my neck. I tried to shake off the feeling that we shouldn't be there, but with each step, that feeling only grew stronger. When we reached the mansion, I stopped to stare at it, looming above us like something out of a nightmare. The house was massive, with high, gabled windows and turrets, its wood blackened and warped. It looked as if it had absorbed every storm that had hit it, every dark day, every lost hour. The windows were broken in places, the roof sagging, but it seemed alive, somehow. "Well?" Caleb grinned, nudging me. "Are we going in or not?" I didn't answer, but I followed him up the stairs, my heart pounding. The door was unlocked, groaning as it swung open to reveal the house's vast, empty foyer. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling faintly of mold and decay. As we stepped inside, our flashlights cut through the dark, revealing old, peeling wallpaper, ornate but cracked chandeliers, and a long staircase that twisted up into the shadows. Portraits hung along the walls, their faces blurred with age, their eyes darkened by grime. "Wow," Caleb whispered, looking around in awe. "Can you imagine living here?" I shook my head. There was no way I could ever call a place like this home, but there was something odd about it. As I glanced around, the shadows seemed to ripple, like the walls themselves were breathing. I forced myself to look away and followed Caleb through a large archway that led to the parlor. It was filled with antique furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust. On the mantel, a large mirror was cracked, the fragments casting strange reflections of the room. Caleb moved deeper into the house, his flashlight flickering over the walls. I tried to keep close, but as we wandered through room after room, I started to lose my sense of direction. Each room felt the same shadows, the same eerie quiet. It was like we were walking in circles, though Caleb seemed unbothered. At one point, we entered a room that felt different. It was a bedroom, with a large canopy bed, its sheets torn and yellowed. The air here was colder, biting, and I could swear I heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible. "Do you hear that?" I asked Caleb, my voice trembling. He turned, flashlight held under his chin, grinning. "You're just spooking yourself, man." But then we both heard it, a faint voice, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. "Help me." We froze, staring at each other. The voice was so faint, so distant, that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, and I felt a wave of nausea. There was someone else here, or something else. Caleb's eyes were wide with excitement. "Let's find out where it's coming from." "Are you serious?" I whispered, my whole body tense with fear. This is crazy. We should go." He just shrugged. "If you want to leave, fine. I'll be back in a few." And then, without another word, he walked down the hall, his flashlight bobbing as he disappeared around a corner. I stayed where I was, listening to his footsteps fade. My mind raced with every story I'd heard, every warning I'd ignored. But part of me was still too curious, too drawn in to leave. So, with a shaky breath, I followed him. The hallway grew colder as I walked, the darkness pressing closer. I reached a large, arched doorway where Caleb had gone and stepped inside, hoping to see him there. But he was nowhere to be seen. I was alone. "Caleb," I called, my voice barely louder than a whisper. My flashlight flickered, and the room seemed to stretch longer and darker. I heard the voice again, but now it sounded closer. I began walking through the house, room after room, searching for him. But each room was empty, the silence pressing against my ears. I started calling his name louder, hoping he'd answer, but my own voice only echoed back at me. The rooms began to feel wrong. Somehow, they weren't in the same places they'd been moments before, as if the house was shifting around me, trapping me in some twisted labyrinth. I realized with horror that I couldn't find my way back to the front door. As I stumbled into yet another room, something caught my eye, a flicker in the corner. When I shone my flashlight on it, I saw Caleb's backpack lying on the floor, but he was gone. The cold sank deeper into my bones. I picked up the backpack, my heart racing as I called his name again. Still, there was no answer. Then I noticed something else, a dark, wet smear on the floor, leading out into the hall. It looked like blood. I stepped back, horrified, and stumbled into a wall. When I turned, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hanging on the wall in front of me was a portrait, one I hadn't seen before. It was dusty, the colors faded, but I recognized the face immediately. It was Caleb. The painting showed him standing in the foyer, his face eerily still, his eyes hollow and lifeless. I backed away, struggling to breathe, and found myself running. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to get out. The hallways twisted and turned, each one leading to another room, another empty, endless space. And with every step, I felt the house closing in around me, its walls narrowing, its shadows darkening. I heard the voice again, louder this time, clear and unmistakable. It wasn't Caleb. It was a woman's voice, soft and gentle, but filled with something dark. "Welcome back." I stopped, heart racing, and saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her hair flowing around her face, her eyes dark and hollow. She smiled, a slow, eerie smile, and raised her hand, pointing directly at me. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The house seemed to shift with me, each door leading to another dead end, another hallway that stretched endlessly into darkness. I was trapped. Just when I thought I would lose myself completely, I saw it. A door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, light spilling through. I sprinted toward it, throwing it open and bursting through. I found myself back in the foyer, gasping for breath, the cold air hitting me like a wave. I stumbled out of the house, down the stairs, and collapsed on the grass outside, my heart pounding. When I looked back, the door had shut behind me. Caleb was never seen again. The police searched for days, combing through the mansion and the grounds, but they found nothing. No trace of him. But I knew he was still there, trapped inside the house. And every night since, I've dreamed of that portrait, of his lifeless eyes staring out at me from the darkness. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that voice, whispering, "Welcome back." I think the Sable House is waiting for me. They called it the Forest Game. It was an old tradition in my hometown, something passed down through generations of kids looking for a thrill. The rules were simple. You had to go into the woods behind the abandoned fairgrounds, find a hidden clearing, and wait. Once you found the right spot, you were supposed to knock 3 times on a particular tree known as the Old Man, an ancient, gnarled tree with twisted branches that looked like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. Once you knocked, the game began. There were stories, of course. Supposedly, if you played the forest game correctly, something would come to you. Some people said it was a spirit, others a creature, something ancient and unknown. It was a local legend, the kind you'd hear whispered at sleepovers or dared to try on Halloween. My friends and I had always joked about playing, but we'd never actually done it. It was one of those things people talked about, but never went through with. No one really wanted to take the risk. There were rumors about kids who tried the game and had never come back. But that year, curiosity got the best of us. It was the end of summer, and we were all about to head off to different colleges. This was our last chance to try something thrilling, something to remember. My best friends, Tyler, Jade, and Marcus, were just as eager as I was to do something big before we all went our separate ways. We decided to play the forest game. We met up at midnight, each of us carrying a flashlight, and headed toward the woods behind the fairgrounds. The old rides loomed in the dark, silent and rusted, casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. As we passed the carousel, its painted horses faded and cracked. A chill ran down my spine. We entered the woods, pushing our way through thick branches and underbrush. The further we went, the quieter everything became. No wind, no animal sounds, just the crunch of our footsteps on the dry leaves. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, we found the clearing. The old man tree stood in the center, tall and foreboding, its twisted branches stark against the dark sky. "This is it," Tyler whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. We gathered around the tree, exchanging nervous glances. None of us wanted to be the one to start. Finally, Jade rolled her eyes and stepped forward. She raised her hand, hesitated, and then knocked 3 times on the rough bark of the old man tree. Nothing happened. We waited, hearts pounding, barely breathing. But the forest remained silent. "Guess it's just a dumb legend," Marcus said, laughing nervously. He turned to leave, but Jade grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" We all went quiet, straining our ears. And then I heard it, faint and distant, the sound of laughter. It was a child's laugh, echoing through the trees, coming from somewhere deep within the forest. "That's weird," Tyler muttered, glancing around. "Maybe there's someone else out here." We huddled closer together, unsure what to do. The laughter grew louder, closer, and then faded, replaced by a soft whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a chorus of voices, speaking in unison, low and urgent. A cold breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of something old and rotten. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Let's get out of here," Marcus whispered, his voice shaky. But as we turned to leave, something changed. The path we'd taken into the clearing was gone, replaced by a wall of dense trees. I glanced around, heart racing, realizing that the entire clearing had shifted. The trees seemed closer now, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the moonlight. We came from that way, didn't we?" Jade asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, I'm sure of it," I replied, trying to keep calm. "Let's just go. Maybe we just got turned around." But no matter which direction we went, we found ourselves back in the same clearing, standing before the old man tree. Panic started to settle in. I could see it in my friends' faces, hear it in their voices as they began to argue, blaming each other for the idea in the first place. "It was just a stupid game," Marcus shouted. "There's no such thing as spirits or forest demons or—" But he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he stared over my shoulder. I turned, following his gaze, and felt my blood run cold. There was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, with limbs too long and twisted, like branches reaching out in every direction. Its face was pale, featureless, except for 2 black holes where its eyes should have been. It stood perfectly still, watching us, its head tilted slightly, as if studying us. We all froze, staring at the figure in horror, too afraid to move. Then, slowly, it began to walk toward us, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Each step brought it closer, its eyes locked on us, empty and hollow. The whispering grew louder, filling the air, voices overlapping in a cacophony of sounds, laughter, crying, and something that sounded like pleading. "Run," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run." We bolted, each of us darting in different directions, desperate to escape. The trees closed in around me as I ran, branches scratching at my arms and face. I could hear my friends' footsteps behind me, their ragged breaths echoing in the silence. But no matter how far I ran, I kept ending up back in the same place. The clearing, with the old man tree standing at its center, and the figure waiting, closer now, its dark eyes watching me. I stumbled, falling to my knees, gasping for breath. Tyler appeared beside me, his face pale and terrified. We can't get out," he panted, his voice breaking. "It won't let us leave." The figure took another step toward us, its head tilting as if in curiosity. I could see it more clearly now. The skin was stretched tight over its bones, its hands ending in long, sharp fingers that looked like they could tear through flesh. It raised one hand, beckoning to us, a slow, deliberate gesture. "Please," I whispered, backing away. "Just let us go." The figure stopped, its head tilting the other way, as if considering my words. For a moment, the whispering stopped, and the forest was silent. Then it spoke. Play the game. The words were soft, barely more than a breath, but they filled the clearing, echoing through the trees. It felt like a command, an unbreakable rule that we'd somehow violated. What game?" Jade asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It only pointed to the old man tree, its black eyes fixed on us. Realization hit me, a sickening thought that made my stomach turn. We had started the game, but we hadn't finished it. And whatever this thing was, it wouldn't let us leave until we did. "Knock again," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We have to knock again." Tyler nodded, too terrified to argue. Together, we approached the tree, each of us raising a trembling hand. We knocked 3 times, the sound echoing through the clearing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground began to shake. The trees around us groaned, their branches twisting and writhing as if they were alive. The figure watched us, silent and still, as the earth split open at the base of the tree, revealing a dark, gaping hole. The whispering returned, louder now, filling the air with voices that sounded like children, crying out in pain and fear. The figure gestured toward the hole, its eyes never leaving us. Play the game. It repeated, a dark, mocking tone in its voice. I realized, with a cold dread settling in my stomach, that we had only 2 choices: enter the hole or stay in the clearing forever, trapped with this thing. Without another word, I stepped forward, forcing myself to move. My friends followed, each of us driven by a primal need to escape, to end this nightmare. We climbed into the hole, the darkness swallowing us. The earth closed above us, sealing us inside. And then, there was nothing. I woke up the next morning on the edge of the woods, lying in the dirt, my clothes torn and filthy. My friends were there too, unconscious but breathing, scattered around me. We all looked at each other, too terrified to speak, each of us remembering the same thing: the figure, the tree, the game. We left town the next day, each of us going our separate ways. We never talked about what happened, never told anyone what we'd seen, but I know we'll never forget it. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it, the sound of laughter, echoing through my dreams, and a voice whispering, just at the edge of my hearing. Play the game. And I know that someday, I'll have to go back. It started with a dare. My friend Ben was obsessed with the occult, urban legends, haunted places, anything that would give him a thrill. We'd spent countless weekends exploring abandoned buildings, cemeteries, and supposedly haunted spots around town. But then he heard about the Mirror Man, and everything changed. The story went like this. If you wanted to see the Mirror Man, you had to play his game. You needed a mirror, any mirror, and you had to perform a series of steps exactly at midnight. The legend was clear. If you did this wrong, or if you disrespected him, he would follow you forever. None of us really believed in the Mirror Man, but Ben was determined to try. "Come on, it'll be fun," he'd said, grinning like he always did when he was about to do something stupid. What's the worst that could happen? I hesitated. Something about this one felt different, but Ben wouldn't take no for an answer. So that Friday night, we met up at his place and set up the mirror in his basement. The basement was already creepy enough. Bare concrete walls, a few flickering light bulbs, and piles of old junk his parents had stored over the years. We placed a mirror on the floor in the center of the room, and Ben knelt down in front of it. The rest of us, me, Jess, and Mike, stood a few steps back, watching nervously. At midnight, Ben began the ritual. Mirror Man, he whispered, his voice echoing in the silent room. I seek your face, your hand, your grace. Show yourself to me. We all held our breath, waiting. Nothing happened. Ben shot us a smirk, clearly unimpressed. Guess it's just another fake. But then, just as he was about to stand up, the mirror started to fog. It was subtle at first, just a faint mist creeping across the glass, but soon it grew thicker, until we could barely see our reflections. Did you do that?" Jess whispered, gripping my arm. "No," Ben said, frowning. He leaned closer to the mirror, his face almost touching the glass. This is new." As we stared, shapes began to emerge in the fog. A pair of eyes, dark and empty, stared back at us, hollow and expressionless. They looked wrong, somehow, like they didn't belong in a human face. They were too deep, too dark, as if they were windows into a void that stretched on forever. We all took a step back, but Ben stayed where he was, transfixed by the figure in the mirror. A cold dread settled over me, making my skin prickle. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. The figure began to take shape, a face, pale and expressionless, with thin, stretched skin that barely seemed to cling to its skull. Its lips were thin and cracked, twisted into a faint smile. The face was familiar, yet wrong in every possible way. It was Ben's face, distorted and hollow, staring back at us with those dead, empty eyes. "Ben, let's go," I whispered, grabbing his shoulder. "This isn't funny anymore." But he didn't respond. He was frozen, his eyes locked on the mirror, his mouth slightly open as if he were in a trance. I shook him, harder this time, but he didn't even blink. And then, slowly, the figure in the mirror raised a hand. Its fingers were long and thin, ending in sharp, black nails that looked like they could slice through flesh. It pressed its hand against the glass, leaving streaks of black where its fingers touched. I watched, horrified, as Ben's hand moved to match it, pressing against the mirror as if compelled. The mirror began to crack under their touch, thin lines spreading out from where their hands met. The cracks twisted and spiraled, forming shapes that looked like symbols, strange and unreadable, covering the entire surface of the glass. "Ben, stop it," Jess screamed, pulling at his arm, but he wouldn't move. His eyes were locked on the figure, his hand pressed firmly against the mirror, as if he were glued to it. The figure's mouth began to move, stretching into a grotesque smile that split its face almost in half. It was whispering something, but the words were garbled, like they were coming from deep underwater. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, until I could finally make out a single word. "Stay." Suddenly, Ben's hand was pulled forward, his fingers slipping into the mirror as if it were liquid. He screamed, trying to pull back, but it was too late. The figure was dragging him in, its bony fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him deeper and deeper into the glass. We all lunged forward, grabbing onto Ben, trying to pull him back. His face was twisted in terror, his eyes wide as he struggled against the force pulling him into the mirror. I could feel his arm slipping, feel him being pulled further away, and then, snap, the mirror shattered. Glass flew everywhere, and we all stumbled back, shielding our faces. When I opened my eyes, Ben was gone. The mirror was empty, its surface cracked and broken. The glass scattered across the floor. All that was left was the faint outline of a handprint, black and smudged, on the shattered glass. "Ben?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. She looked around, as if expecting him to reappear, but the basement was empty. We called his name, searched every corner of the room, but he was gone, vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. In the days that followed, we searched everywhere for him. We told the police, told his parents, but no one believed us. They thought he'd just run away. But we knew the truth. We'd seen him taken, seen him disappear into the mirror. And that's when it started. The first night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face in the mirror, that twisted smile and those empty eyes. But then, as I was drifting off, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Stay." I shot up, heart pounding, and looked around. The room was empty, but the sound persisted, coming from somewhere close. Slowly, I turned to my mirror, dread pooling in my stomach. And there, in the glass, was a handprint, black and smudged, pressed against the surface, just like the one in the basement. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, overlapping voices that sounded like laughter, like crying, like screaming. I watched in horror as the mirror began to fog, shapes forming in the mist. Faces, twisted and distorted, pressing against the glass, watching me with empty eyes. The whispers grew louder, voices chanting, calling to me, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a towel, threw it over the mirror, and bolted out of the room, my heart racing. I spent the rest of the night in the hallway, too afraid to go back inside. But it didn't end there. Every mirror I looked into, every reflective surface, I saw him, Ben, his face twisted and hollow, watching me with that same dead smile. No matter where I went, he was there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, his eyes following me. It wasn't just me. Jess and Mike saw him too. Jess called me one night, sobbing, saying she'd seen him in her bathroom mirror, his fingers reaching out to her, whispering her name. We tried everything to get rid of him. We broke our mirrors, covered them, even moved to different houses. But it didn't matter. He was always there, waiting, watching. We had broken the rules. We hadn't finished the game, hadn't respected him, and now we were cursed to see him forever, to feel his presence, lurking in every mirror, every glass, every shadow. Sometimes I hear him in the dead of night, whispering through the mirror, calling my name. And I know, someday, he'll come for me, just like he came for Ben. Because once you start the game, you can never stop playing. And the Mirror Man, he never lets you go.